I never expected a simple fence to turn my quiet neighborhood into a war zone. One afternoon, men claiming to be HOA officers showed up at my property, badges flashing, voices sharp, and a gun drawn as if I'd committed a serious crime. My heart raced, adrenaline surging, as they demanded I tear down what I had every right to build. It was surreal. Fake authority, intimidation, and danger staring me in the face on my own land. But I wasn't about to let fear dictate my property. What happened next would shock them, and anyone who ever thought HOA rules were just annoying paperwork. Before the chaos began, life in my neighborhood was peaceful in a way that made every day feel ordinary but good. I had moved to this quiet suburban enclave seeking space, privacy, and a sense of control over my own property. A modest house with a well-kept yard, a small garden where I grew vegetables, and a stretch of fence that marked the edge of my land. The community seemed calm, neighbors polite, but mostly distant. The kind of place where everyone minded their own business, and routine walks, or weekend chores, were enough to pass the time. My days were filled with simple pleasures: tending to the garden, painting the fence, watching birds flit across the lawn, or enjoying a quiet evening on the porch. It was life uncomplicated, predictable, and comfortable. The HOA, at first, was a distant administrative presence, a group that sent occasional newsletters about rules and meetings, but had little real impact on my life. I paid my dues, filed my paperwork when necessary, and otherwise didn't think much about them. But even in this calm, there were subtle hints of control that some residents seemed to embrace eagerly. Whispers about proper property lines, casual references to community standards, and occasional debates about who was or wasn't following the rules. At the time, I shrugged these off. It didn't seem like anything that would ever touch me. That all changed with the decision to install a small section of fence along my property line. It wasn't elaborate or obstructive, just a practical boundary to mark my land and keep my garden secure. Yet, what seemed like a simple act of ownership triggered a chain reaction. One neighbor in particular, a self-appointed enforcer of HOA standards, began scrutinizing my property, questioning permits I didn't need, and insisting I was violating some unwritten rule. At first, it was subtle. Pointed looks from across the yard, unsolicited advice on fence materials, veiled warnings slipped into conversation. I tried to remain calm, thinking the tension would fade once the fence was complete. But the first formal notice arrived unexpectedly: an official-looking letter from the HOA claiming my fence was unauthorized and non-compliant with community aesthetics. The wording was vague, the claims exaggerated, but the message was clear: someone had decided my property wasn't entirely my own. Even as I read the letter, a sense of unease began to creep in, an awareness that this wasn't going to be a simple correction or polite warning. There were rules being weaponized, authority being faked, and a mindset that my home was no longer just mine. By the time I realized the seriousness of the situation, the intimidation had already begun. A casual walk past my yard became a calculated risk. Strangers claiming HOA authority appeared unexpectedly, asking to inspect the fence, noting its height and placement, implying violations that didn't exist. Each encounter chipped away at the calm I had once felt on my property. Every sound outside, every knock on the door, carried tension, a reminder that ownership can be contested in ways that feel personal, invasive, and even threatening. Looking back, the setup was deceptively ordinary. The neighborhood looked the same, the streets quiet, the gardens well tended. But underneath that calm was a current of entitlement, of bureaucratic overreach, and the brewing storm that would eventually erupt into a confrontation I could never have imagined. The fence was only the beginning, a trigger that would reveal how far some people would go to assert control over a property that wasn't theirs, and how far I would have to go to protect what was indisputably mine. At first, the HOA's interference seemed almost bureaucratic, harmless even. Letters about noncompliance and reminders that my fence supposedly violated community aesthetics, the type of small, impersonal annoyances most homeowners shrug off. But those letters were only the beginning. Soon, the subtlety vanished, replaced by direct intimidation. Men claiming to be HOA officers began showing up unannounced at my property, their presence heavy, the sharpness of their demeanor unmistakable. They inspected the fence with exaggerated seriousness, measuring, taking photos, and asking questions in a tone that implied I was in serious trouble. It was clear their visits weren't about rules, they were about asserting power. The harassment escalated quickly. One morning, I discovered a notice tacked to my front gate, a fine for unauthorized property modifications. There was no legitimate basis, no real violation of law, only the HOA's arbitrary assertion that the fence was unacceptable. They were testing me, seeing how far they could push, and each time I ignored a letter or refused to comply, the threats became more direct. Phone calls at odd hours, vague warnings about legal action, and veiled comments from neighbors who had suddenly adopted the HOA's perspective made the neighborhood feel smaller, constricting, like walls closing in around me. Then the intimidation became physical. I arrived home one evening to find my fence had been tampered with. Posts loosened, boards shifted, some of the pickets splintered. Someone had entered my property, violated my space, and left a message they could get away with it. Fear and anger surged together. I was on my own land, yet powerless to prevent this intrusion. Every repair I made felt like a declaration, every hammer strike a heartbeat of defiance against the encroaching authority. The more I resisted, the bolder they became. Men arrived claiming to represent the HOA, demanding immediate removal of the fence, their voices sharp, their movements assertive, their presence unmistakably threatening. They waved papers at me, as though the threat of bureaucracy equaled the threat of force. Each interaction escalated my frustration, my disbelief, and my determination. These weren't neighbors looking out for community standards. They were bullies hiding behind fake authority, and I knew I couldn't cede ground. Even the neighborhood itself began to feel hostile. Whispers spread. I was difficult, non-compliant, provoking the HOA. Passers-by eyed the fence, some nodding in agreement with the accusations, others simply avoiding eye contact. The subtle social pressure was another weapon, another layer of harassment designed to make me question my decisions. But every day I reminded myself, the fence was my property, built legally, and I had every right to defend it. The tension reached new heights when one of the men showed up brandishing a weapon. The moment froze in my mind, a stranger, claiming authority I had never granted, standing mere feet from my fence with a gun slung, demanding I dismantle what was mine. My heart pounded, adrenaline flooding my system, and I realized that ignoring the threats or relying on passive resistance was no longer an option. The intimidation had become a direct danger, and it was a test not just of property rights, but of courage, control, and strategy. I took careful, deliberate action. Cameras were installed, positions noted, potential angles for confrontation analyzed. Each visit, each letter, each veiled threat became part of a growing record. I documented everything: the date, the time, the words, the mannerisms, The very presence of these fake officers attempting to leverage fear over legal authority. The process was painstaking, emotionally taxing, but it also forged a growing determination. I realized that preparation, clarity, and decisiveness would be my only tools to reclaim control over my property. The psychological warfare continued. Even when the men weren't physically present, their influence lingered in subtle ways. The sound of a car slowing outside my gate, a shadow passing across a window, the occasional knock that made me flinch despite knowing no one had legitimate reason to be there. Every encounter reminded me that these were not casual nuisances. They were orchestrated attempts to test my limits, to provoke a reaction that could be used against me. But each challenge strengthened my resolve rather than weakening it. One morning, a new letter arrived claiming I had violated community safety protocols, and warning that immediate legal action would be taken if the fence was not removed. The letter was unsigned, official-looking, and clearly intended to intimidate rather than inform. I stared at it for hours, realizing that their game was escalating. The message was clear: they wanted me to act out of fear, to hand over control without resistance. But I refused. I would not allow threats, falsified authority, or intimidation to dictate what I could do on my own land. The next encounter brought the rising tension to a boiling point. I returned home one afternoon to find two men at my fence, badges displayed, tone sharp, and the unspoken expectation that I would comply immediately. They ignored my explanation, my calm assertion of rights, and continued to make veiled threats. The air crackled with confrontation, each second stretching as I assessed their intentions, aware that any wrong move could be disastrous. Yet I stood firm, every muscle tense, every sense alert. The rising action had reached its apex. The intimidation had become direct, tangible, and undeniable, and I could no longer treat it as a peripheral annoyance. It was in these moments that strategy and documentation became essential. I recorded interactions, mapped movements, noted the physical presence of the alleged officers, and reinforced the fence. Each act was deliberate, a measure of both defense and provocation, enough to assert authority over my property without risking escalation beyond control. Every letter, every visit, every suspicious movement was added to a growing dossier that would prove crucial when the confrontation became inevitable. But the HOA wasn't finished. The fake officers began circulating rumors in the neighborhood, accusing me of harassment, illegal construction, and even exaggerating claims of threatening behavior. Neighbors who had remained neutral began to shift their perception, either aligning with the HOA out of fear or avoiding any engagement with me. The social isolation was intentional, a psychological tool designed to weaken confidence and provoke mistakes. Yet, I recognized it for what it was: another tactic, another layer of manipulation to be anticipated, documented, and countered. The final days before the climactic confrontation were a careful balance of observation and readiness. I monitored every movement near the property, reinforced security systems, and planned contingencies. Each morning, I would check the fence, the cameras, the surrounding area, ensuring that when the moment came, I would be prepared. Every letter, every veiled threat, every intrusion had contributed to this preparation. The rising action wasn't just about building tension. It was about shaping the battlefield, both mentally and physically, for the decisive moment that would define control over my own land. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and shadows stretched across the yard, I saw them, two men approaching with purpose, badges visible, hands on what appeared to be firearms holstered or slung across their bodies. They ignored the posted signs, the warnings, the camera lenses tracking their every move. The tension in the air was electric. The neighborhood silent, the stage set. This was no longer a test of patience, it was a direct challenge. The rising action had reached its zenith. I was ready. And the moment for confrontation was imminent. Every step they took toward the fence, every subtle adjustment of their stance, every glint of light on metal told me this was the culmination of months of harassment, intimidation, and petty authority abuse. And yet, I remained calm, heart steady, mind sharp, knowing that the upcoming clash would not be dictated by fear, but by preparation, documentation, and an unwavering assertion of rights. The stakes had never been higher, the tension never more palpable, and the question lingered in the air. Would they finally recognize the limits of their authority, or would this confrontation escalate into something neither side could easily control? The rising action left me poised on the edge of certainty and danger, every sense alert, every strategy rehearsed. It was more than a story of offense. It was a story of property, autonomy, intimidation, and the unyielding resolve to protect what was rightfully mine. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, where fear, audacity, and authority would collide, and the outcome would determine not just the control of a fence, but the assertion of law, rights, and personal sovereignty over petty tyranny. The day of confrontation arrived like a storm, breaking over a calm lake, sudden, charged, and impossible to ignore. For weeks, I had been preparing meticulously, reviewing every interaction, every letter, every intrusion by the so-called HOA officers, cataloging details, installing cameras, reinforcing the fence, and planning contingencies. But nothing could fully capture the surge of adrenaline as I saw them approaching my property. That afternoon, badges displayed, hands brushing against holstered firearms, the air around them heavy with implied authority and threat. Their strides confident, predatory even, as if my decades of ownership meant nothing and their self-assumed power was absolute. My heart pounded, every sense alert, every instinct screaming that this was the moment months of intimidation had been building toward, a tipping point where fear, authority, and audacity collided. And yet, despite the surge of adrenaline and the obvious danger, I remained calm, deliberate, calculating every movement, knowing that a single misstep could escalate the situation beyond control. And as they reached the edge of my property, I stepped forward to meet them, the shotgun I had kept ready across my shoulders. Catching the sunlight, polished wood gleaming, barrel pointed safely to the ground, yet unmistakably visible, a quiet, resolute statement that authority cannot be faked. When confronted with preparation and resolve, the effect was immediate. Their confident strides faltered, smirks faded, and hesitation replaced arrogance, the unspoken realization dawning that the intimidation they had wielded with impunity was meeting its match. And as I advanced another deliberate step, cameras silently recording every detail, every expression, every subtle movement, the tension became almost tactile, charged with anticipation, fear, and the weight of legality poised against bravado. One of the men whispered to the others, glancing nervously at the equipment I had installed, their eyes flicking toward the fence, the property, the law, and finally me, assessing for the first time that their bluff had been called, that the facade of power was fragile, and that the consequences of overreach were real, immediate, and undeniable. And I could feel a surge of vindication and focus intertwining, knowing that all the documentation, all the planning, every long hour of meticulous preparation was converging into this exact moment. The tallest man, who had once swaggered toward the property with unquestioned confidence, stepped back slightly, his hand lowering in subtle surrender, while the others exchanged glances filled with the dawning horror of miscalculation. And as I raised a single finger in measured warning, the silence became deafening, the only sounds the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of traffic, and the subtle creak of the fence underfoot, each amplified in the still tension, signaling that this confrontation was no longer about threats or fear, but about control, ownership, and the undeniable right to defend one's home against those who misuse authority for intimidation. Slowly, deliberately, I signaled them to leave, my posture unwavering, my eyes locked on theirs, and they began retreating, glancing over shoulders, uncertain, cautious, finally recognizing that trespass, deception, and intimidation met consequences when confronted with preparation, clarity, and decisive action. And as their figures receded toward the edge of the property, I lowered the shotgun, steadying hands that had been tense for hours, and allowed myself a moment to breathe, heart still racing but mind clear, the realization sinking in that months of harassment, anxiety, and confrontation had culminated not in chaos or fear, but in undeniable vindication and restored authority over my land. Yet, even in the relief, I knew this confrontation wasn't just an end, it was a pivot, a transformation of the neighborhood dynamic. The HOA's perceived power irrevocably diminished, their tactics exposed, and my property rights reaffirmed in a way that was impossible to ignore or dismiss. And while the immediate threat had passed, the echo of that day lingered, a tangible reminder that readiness, preparation, and unwavering resolve are far more powerful than intimidation. That authority must be earned and is meaningless when faked, and that standing firm in the face of audacity can transform fear into triumph, creating a precedent that would resonate beyond the boundaries of a single fence, a single property, or a single confrontation. And as I surveyed the calm of my yard, the fence standing intact, the cameras silently recording every last retreating step, I understood that the lesson had been delivered. Not through aggression, but through strategy, courage, and the unshakable assertion of what was mine, and the question hung in the charged, quiet air, a cliffhanger in itself. Would those who had tried to intimidate ever truly learn the cost of overreach? Or would audacity one day dare return to test boundaries that had now been firmly and decisively established? After the standoff with the fake HOA officers, a heavy, almost surreal calm settled over my property. The kind that comes only after a storm has passed, and the air is thick with both relief and the lingering awareness of what had just occurred. The tension that had dominated my days and haunted my nights gradually gave way to clarity, as I began the painstaking process of not only reinforcing my physical boundaries but also asserting the legal and psychological authority that had been challenged for so long. Knowing that the fence itself, once a simple structure marking property lines, had become a symbol of resilience, preparation, and the unmistakable assertion of my rights. In the weeks that followed, I reviewed every interaction, every document, every recording I had meticulously gathered, creating an ironclad dossier that would ensure that any future attempts at intimidation could be countered decisively. And the very act of assembling this evidence transformed months of fear, frustration, and anger into empowerment, as I recognized that knowledge and preparation are as potent as any weapon when confronting those who abuse perceived authority. The neighborhood itself began to shift in response. Subtle at first, neighbors who had whispered doubts or aligned themselves with the HOA now approached with cautious respect, their perceptions of the conflict shaped by the undeniable outcome of my confrontation. and even those who had remained neutral seemed to understand that trespass and intimidation would no longer go unchallenged, that property rights and personal boundaries were enforceable not just by law, but by readiness and courage, and that audacity unchecked would meet consequences in ways that could no longer be ignored. The HOA, once confident in their ability to coerce and manipulate through letters, veiled threats, and fake authority, found their influence irreparably diminished, their reputation in the community tarnished, and their tactics rendered ineffective, not through escalation or retaliation, but through calm, deliberate preparation, strategic action, and unwavering assertion of rights, demonstrating to everyone that power rooted in deception is fragile when confronted with clarity, evidence, and decisive resolve. Personally, the experience left an indelible mark, transforming what had begun as fear and frustration into confidence and self-assuredness, teaching me that vigilance, preparation, and a measured response are far more powerful than aggression or panic, and that even when faced with audacity and intimidation, one can maintain control through foresight, strategy, and calm determination. A lesson that extended beyond the immediate conflict into every facet of life, reinforcing the value of standing firm when principles and property are challenged. Over time, I fortified my fence, upgraded security systems, and continued documenting interactions, not out of paranoia, but as a proactive assertion of sovereignty. Each action a statement to both myself and the community that independence and autonomy are rights worth defending, and that the cost of complacency in the face of intimidation is far greater than the effort required to prepare and respond. The ripple effects of the confrontation extended beyond my property lines. The community, once passive or complicit, now carried a collective awareness that authority must be legitimate to command compliance, that intimidation tactics will be scrutinized and recorded, and that individuals who assert their rights with knowledge and courage can shift the balance of power, fostering an environment where respect is earned rather than assumed, and where petty bureaucracy or overreach is met with preparedness rather than fear. Socially, the neighborhood dynamics changed as well. Conversations shifted, gossip quieted, and the previously casual arrogance of HOA enforcers was replaced with cautious engagement, as their past actions had been exposed and the consequences of overreach demonstrated, reinforcing the principle that credibility is fragile and must be upheld through integrity rather than intimidation. Emotionally, the ordeal left me with a complex mix of relief, vindication, and reflection. Relief that immediate danger had passed, vindication that months of harassment and threats had been met with resolute defense and legal preparation, and reflection on how ordinary disputes over property can escalate into battles over respect, authority, and personal sovereignty, revealing the extraordinary stakes hidden beneath seemingly mundane neighborhood conflicts. The confrontation and its aftermath also created a lasting psychological shift, both in myself and in the broader community, illustrating that fear can be transformed into empowerment when matched with knowledge, preparation, and calm decisiveness, and that asserting boundaries is not an act of aggression, but a reaffirmation of autonomy and dignity. Principles that are often overlooked until challenged by audacity or abuse. As months passed, the fence remained intact, the cameras silently recording any approach, the signs of previous intimidation gradually fading from the property itself, but never from memory, serving as a constant reminder that vigilance is a continuing practice, and that the lessons learned extend far beyond a single conflict, shaping the way I approached interactions, assessed risk, and maintained control over my life and surroundings. The HOA, stripped of credibility and humbled by the decisive confrontation, adjusted their behavior permanently, and while some attempted to reassert influence in subtle ways, the knowledge that overreach would be met with preparation and assertiveness acted as a powerful deterrent, reinforcing the message that authority without legitimacy is impotent when confronted with awareness, strategy, and courage. Ultimately, the experience reinforced an essential truth: boundaries, whether physical, legal, or psychological, must be recognized and defended. And while intimidation may provoke fear, clarity, preparation, and calm decisiveness turn that fear into strength. And that even in a world where bureaucracy, entitlement, and audacity collide, standing firmly in one's rights is the most powerful deterrent against abuse, creating lasting change, respect, and balance. Walking the perimeter of my property now, watching the sunlight glint off the fence I had fought to protect, and listening to the quiet hum of a neighborhood forever altered by one determined defense, I felt a profound sense of peace and accomplishment, tempered by the awareness that freedom is not passive, that respect is not automatic, and that vigilance and assertiveness are essential companions to autonomy. And as I reflected on the months of conflict, intimidation, and ultimate resolution, one thought crystallized into an enduring lesson: audacity and entitlement may push boundaries, but when met with preparation, strategy, and unwavering resolve, those boundaries are not just defended. They are defined, respected, and impossible to challenge, leaving a lasting mark on both the property and the principle that no one, no organization, and no false authority can ever claim what is rightfully yours.